Christopher Columbus. What a piece of work. We have a national holiday dedicated to this guy. All the history books prop him up as some kind of spectacular hero to the Native Americans. And there's even been world fairs dedicated to his achievements. However, everywhere you look, there is controversy surrounding his achievements. He did not discover America. He was a fraud. He doesn't deserve statues or holidays in his honor. Here we have biography.com. Was Christopher Columbus a hero or a villain? And history.com. Why Columbus Day courts controversy. Now, we'll look into all that. And also, why is he holding his hand like this with the two middle fingers together, the index and the pinky separated? You'd think it's just random, the painter decided to paint it that way. But upon looking further into history and at older drawings and paintings of Tartarians, the people of Tartary, you'll find that they all, interestingly, have the same hand symbol with the two middle fingers together, the index and the pinky separated. Here we have it. Here we have it. And here we have it. So it's no coincidence that once the Tartarians had been removed from history, we find people like Christopher Columbus secretly making their hand symbol in his paintings. Here he is with his beloved globe, as his discovery proved that to be fact. And we'll even look at some older paintings, some maps that have Christopher Columbus in them. Here is a text about Christopher Columbus and a portrait of his bust, as well as you will find him over here encountering Native Americans, but also an unknown type of people who have weapons and shields, clothes, and skin color which does not resemble any of the Native Americans that he was supposed to encounter. Surprisingly enough, we'll also find information on this map about the Tartarians and how they were definitely in this area of the world at the time when Christopher Columbus came here. That's probably why you'll notice somebody like this, who you would actually expect to find existing in a city that looked more along the lines of these. But a future video is going to cover the World Columbian Exposition in Chicago, where we'll discuss the possibility that this city was not built of plaster and stucco, but it was in fact already in America when Columbus got here, and that is why they had to completely burn the whole thing to the ground and leave no trace of it, because that would in fact reveal the truth that when Christopher Columbus got to America, he encountered a people who have been completely removed from the history books. But before we go in too deep to what he found when he got to America, let's talk about what happened before he left Spain and came to America. And of course, this is going to get into a topic which is very common in conspiracy, and that is the Jews. So they were in Spain in 1491, and they were in Spain in 1492, but following the Alhambra decree in 1492, they were kicked out of Spain. So the Alhambra decree, which was issued on March 31st, 1492, kicked the Jews out of Spain. Now, they were permitted to take their belongings with them, excluding gold or silver or minted money. They were not allowed to take any money with them, the gold or the silver. And so you'll notice that the date of this is quite interesting, July 31st of that year. And they had to be gone from Spain and its territories with their possessions by July 31st of that year. So July 31st. Now, interestingly enough, Christopher Columbus leaves Spain in the Nina Pinta and Santa Maria on the evening of August 3rd, 1492. Funnily enough, that's only 3 days after the Jews had been kicked out of Spain. I wonder if there's a coincidence on the timing between 3 boats leaving Spain to come to America, and who may have been on those boats. Surely the Nina Pinta and Santa Maria were not loaded up with gold and silver and prominently filled with Jews. Thanks to Sarah Zimmerman from the University of Pennsylvania, we'll find out that although it sounds surprising that many of the early Jews in America were Freemasons, upon further investigation, it would be more surprising if they weren't Freemasons. Now, thanks to this paper and a lot of other historical sources, we can find very strong evidence that the first people in early America were Jews and Freemasons, and there was no separations between the two. They were one and the same. We can even see an example of that on today's dollar bill, where we have the highly Masonic document here, 13 dots here, 13 levels to the pyramid, the all-seeing eye. Spell the word M-A-S-O-N. You can even find 13 leaves, 13 arrows, 13 dots over here, and 13 stars up here, which form, you guessed it, a perfect Star of David. And we can see over the years on the Masonic dollar bill that the Star of David has been there since 1782. And always the Great Seal has had a Star of David right over the head of the eagle. Here we get something that's not quite like that, but of course it was never used. 1841, 1877, 1885, through the current day, we've always had a Star of David right over the top of the eagle's head. And we can see here, of course, with the Ouroboros, snake eating itself, highly Masonic symbolism. Many people are not aware that there were Jews in colonial America, let alone among the ranks of Freemasons. But Jews were some of the most prominent members of their society. Most of them were middle-class shopkeepers and merchants, and some were even rich by the 18th century standard. In 1772, nearly all the Jewish heads of the household ranked among the top 135 taxpayers out of about 1,200 total. Aaron Lopez, a Jew, paid twice the taxes anyone else. His father-in-law, Jacob Riviera, ranked 5th on the list, and Moses Levi ranked 22nd. In addition to monetary wealth, Jews also owned large amounts of land. In 1769, David Franks was 13th largest landowner in Philadelphia with 235 acres of land, and in 1773, Francis Salvador was the largest landowner in his district in South Carolina.
This is the leading Jewish citizen of Rhode Island, Aaron Lopez. He's also a merchant. He's also the wealthiest man in Rhode Island. Here's Abigail Levy Franks herself. And first of all, notice she's wearing blue. Blue is by far the most expensive color to have on your clothing in the 18th century.
Jews had tremendous assets in society, which forced people to pay attention and respect to them. It was this overwhelming majority of the upper and middle class Jews that led to a significant Jewish presence in the fraternity of Freemasons. Freemasonry, especially during the colonial era, was almost exclusively for men of rank, the urban elites. So we can see Jews in early America were certainly prolific, and no coincidence there, because going back to the Alhambra degree, it's quite evident that many Jews, in fact, the Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria, were probably almost exclusively filled with Jews, including their gold and silver. So no coincidence that in early colonial America we find highly wealthy Jews, a large number of them, and that they're all involved with the elite group of people called Freemasonry. And we can see that there's certainly a number of Jewish elites in the ranks of Freemasonry, and that is evidenced by early membership records. So let's look further into the relationship between Jews and Freemasons in the 18th and 19th century. And we can also analyze the Masonic organization at a number of levels and its intersection with Judaism. Interestingly, as we already know, the Jews in America is linked to Christopher Columbus because of the Edict of Exposition, which was published on March, and it gave the Jews until July to leave Spain. Because they weren't allowed to bring gold, silver, coin, money, it is largely thought that the money the Jews were required to leave behind went in part to funding Columbus's journey. So because the Alhambra decree was issued in March, they had all the way until July, or truly August 3rd, to spend all of their money on the boats, food, and materials necessary to relocate from Spain to a land of the free, or a land of the Freemasons, where they would be safe to practice their Freemasonry when other countries were kicking them out. Now, there were 300,000 Jews who were living in Spain in 1492, So obviously not all of them could fit on the boats. It would have been the elite, the richest ones, of course, who would have been able to purchase their way onto the boat in the form of providing financial assistance for the journey to the land of the Freemason. The Jews who arrived in America tended to be wealthy and well-connected. They had incurred a number of contracts across European countries, which gave them advantage in business and trade. And this is why many of them became merchants and shopkeepers when they came to America. Their professions tended to place them in the middle and upper classes, and thus the Jewish population in America tended to be in the upper class. The Freemasons were an elite organization made up primarily of middle and upper class males, so the Jews fit in right there. And while the organization didn't start in America, American lodges developed their own character and made significant contributions to society as a whole. The origins for Freemasonry is not known for certain, and Freemasonry is a male fraternal order, not an association of stone layers. The Brotherhood has a connection with sociability and science. Why science? We'll look into that a little bit further, but traditionally you wouldn't think about Freemasonry as a group of scientists, but in fact I do believe they are a group of scientists and physicists, and there's a lot of evidence to that. In 1723, the Masonic constitutions were published and quickly became a canonical Masonic text. And let's note that what came first, was it the Masonic Constitution or the Constitution of the United States? And of course, it was the Masonic Constitution that came first of 1723. And after that, they said, hey, this worked great for our Freemasonry and our land of the Freemason. We need one for that as well. We're going to call it the Constitution of the United States. And that came much later in 1789. By the 1760s, Americans had broken with the orthodoxy of the Grand Lodge and its official history. This was the shift from the moderns to the ancients. Somewhat counterintuitively, the moderns are the older form of Masonry and the ancients are the newer form. By the time the American Grand Lodges were formed after the American Revolution, 55% of them claimed that they had come from ancient lodges, showing that ancient Masonry had firmly established itself in the colonies. However, ancient Masonry was not the only variation that found a home in American colonies. Organizations that utilized symbolic Masonry formed, including the York Rite and Scottish Rite groups, which are characterized by their own hierarchical systems. The Scottish Rite, also referred to as perfect and sublime Masonry, or later known as ancient and accepted Scottish Rite, emerged through the ancients as a system of higher degrees or rankings. The Scottish Rite innovation initially introduced 25 degrees and would eventually have 33. For the purposes of this video, it's important to understand the place of Scottish Rite in America, since it's the type of Masonry with a distinct connection to American Jews. Now, it's appropriate that this thesis comes out of the University of Pennsylvania because Philadelphia, the enlightened colonial city, was the mother city of symbolic Masonry in the Western world and was the revival site for perfect and sublime Masonry, allowing it to become the active, ancient, and accepted Scottish Rite. It was also here that symbolic Masonry became established in the Jewish community and spread through them and across the United States. It is from this point we can begin to establish the connections between Judaism and Masonry in America. And ultimately, although it sounds surprising that many of the early Jews in America were Masons, upon further investigation, it would be more surprising if they weren't. The Star of David, the Seal of Solomon. For the modern Jew, the most recognizable symbol is probably the Star of David. This six-sided star, or hexagram, which has 6 vertices, 6 edges, with an interior angle of 60, or 666, often called a Jewish star, appears on the flag of the State of Israel, a country created to be a nation for the Jews. However, the exclusivity as a Jewish symbol is a modern development. The Star of David was used as early as the Bronze Age, and in its magical applications, it's normally referred to as the Seal of Solomon, referring to the son of King David, the biblical king known for his wisdom. The star was said to have magical properties, and its inscription on the signet of Solomon was said to give him access to the genius that helped him build his temple. Here we have an encyclopedia of Freemasonry and its kindred sciences, and a pretty nice looking book, a square and compass on the inside, but let's look at page 674. The Seal of Solomon, or the Shield of David, is a hexagonal figure consisting of 2 interlacing triangles, thus forming the outlines of a 6-pointed star. Upon it was inscribed one of the sacred names of God from which inscription it was supposed principally to derive its talismanic powers. These powers were very extensive, for it was believed that it would extinguish fire, prevent wounds in a conflict, and perform many other wonders. The Jews called it the Shield of David in reference to the protection which it gave them, but to the other Orientalists it was more familiarly known as the Seal of Solomon. Among these people there is a very prevalent belief in the magical character of the King of Israel. He was esteemed rather as a great magician than as a great monarch, and by the signet which he wore, on which this talismanic seal was engraved, he is supposed to have accomplished the most extraordinary actions, and by it to have enlisted into his service the labors of the genii for the construction of his celebrated temple. Robinson Crusoe and the 1001 Nights are two books which every child has read, and which no man or woman ever forgets. In the later, there are many allusions to Solomon's seal. Especially, there's a story of an unlucky fisherman who has fished up in his net a bottle secured by a leaden stopper on which the seal was impressed. And upon opening it, a fierce, evil genius comes forth, who gives this account of the cause of his imprisonment. Solomon, he said, the son of David exhorted me to embrace the faith and submit to his authority, but I refused. Upon which he called for this bottle and confined me in it, and closed it upon me with this leaden stopper, and stamped upon this seal the great name of God engraved on it. Then he gave the vessel to one of the genii, who submitted to him with orders to cast me into the sea. Did you know that the story of Aladdin with the genie in a bottle was a story about the Star of David and King Solomon? So Solomon's ability to build his temple, which was one of the greatest architectural feats ever, is said to have came from the magical powers of the Star of David. So no surprise we see the magical symbol being discussed here when we're talking about the dollar bill. And we have seen the 13 stars above the eagle have been arranged to represent the two interlocking triangles, the Seal of Solomon or the Star of David, a symbol that is widely used in magical text under a variety of magical names. And I would say that the seal being on the US dollar bill has more to do with its magical properties and less to do with just somebody wanting to put some stars on that paper. Now, the Temple of Solomon has specific significance for Masons because they have traced their history back to the stonemasons who worked on it. So the story of King Solomon using the Star of David's magical powers to help him build the temple would have been important to the Freemasons, and that's why we see them still using it to this day. The temple has specific significance for Masons because they trace their history back to the stonemasons who worked on it. That is referenced in 1 Kings chapter 5, verse 15, where Solomon had 70,000 carriers and 80,000 stonecutters in the hill. So this is when he was building his temple, and these 80,000 stonecutters or stonemasons would be the ones that the Freemasons can trace their lineage back to. These are Jews. The people who were building the temple under King Solomon were certainly Jews. And if the Freemasons can trace their lineage back to the stonemasons who worked on King Solomon's temple, aka the 80,000 stonecutters in the hills from 1 Kings, then they certainly are saying that they are Jews and that their lineage comes from Jews. So there's evidence that Freemasonry and their heritage certainly comes from Jews, and they do believe that they are the ones who built King Solomon's temple. So this story of them using the Star of David or the Seal of Solomon and its magical powers to help them build the temple would be an important story to the Masons. While the star is certainly not one of the most important symbols of Masonry, it does appear in a number of areas, including on seals and as part of the architecture. And I will argue that the star is one of the most important symbols in Freemasonry, and we can see some examples of that easily. Let's take a look at Albert Pike, famous Freemason from the early 1800s, who is a 33-degree Scottish Rite Mason. We can see the eagle like we have on the dollar bill with the 33 here, and again, more double-headed eagle here. But let's take a look at his book, Morals and Dogma, the Ancient Accepted Scottish Rite of Freemasonry. and see just what kind of stuff these guys are into. The occult, perhaps? Lucifer, the light bearer. Lucifer, the son of morning. It is he who bears the light. So this guy is, not only is he a 33-degree Mason, but he's also into the occult. We can see it classifies this as 19th century occultists, and you can definitely learn that if you read his book here. But this is not the only book that he wrote. He also wrote this book, Masonic Formulas and Rituals. Now, this is absolutely a book of magic. It's a grimoire, or a book full of spells and rituals. And Albert Pike studied Freemasonry extensively, locked himself into the Masonic temple and the library, and revised all of the Masonic magical spells and rituals into this book. Now, the interesting things here are, of course, what appears to be a sphere Earth. We've got the square and compass, and we have the Star of David. And the all-seeing eye is right here, and another square and compass. So I would say that the second most important symbol to the Freemasons is the Seal of Solomon. Next to the square and compass, this is definitely the most prominent symbol associated with Freemasonry. But I would say number 2 would be the Seal of Solomon. And one example after the next can be found. This is at the Grand Lodge. Let's see, where does it say? The Grand Lodge of the State of Israel. So this is in Israel at the Masonic Grand Lodge. This is the Masonic HQ. There isn't going to be a place in the world that is more Masonic than the Grand Lodge in the State of Israel. And we can see here, of course, that in addition to the square and compass, the other symbol incorporated here is, of course, the Star of David or the Seal of Solomon. And the all-seeing eye. We've got the all-seeing eye, the square and compass, the Seal of Solomon, and for some reason they are symbolizing the Pythagorean theorem here, or perhaps Pythagorean triplets. But do note that there are a few symbols that are very important to the Masons. They can be seen in this picture. It is the all-seeing eye, the square and compass, the Seal of Solomon or the Star of David, the Pythagorean theorem or Pythagorean triplets, and it looks as though a pentagram around the neck. So I do believe that the Star of David or the Seal of Solomon is one of the most important symbols in Freemasonry, and we can see that is clear as day. Historically, in colonial America, one notable example is on the seal of the Charleston Lodge of Perfection. This seal contains a number of Masonic symbols, including the most famous and identifiable one is square and compass. But in the corner directly above the square and compass, there is the Seal of Solomon. The placement here would seem to indicate a similar regard for the two symbols. In fact, one could argue that the Seal of Solomon is most visible symbol as it's surrounded by a light circle, or the sun, it looks like, against a dark background, while the rest of them all have a dark background. Now, I do want to mention something about this image right here. It's quite an interesting image. And right off the bat, it doesn't seem like there's too much here. But for one, we can see the black and white checkered floor of the lodge, or as they would interpret that as the floor of the King Solomon's temple. Of course, we have the square and compass, the Seal of Solomon. And look at what is going on here. The sun's shining here, and it is going onto this compass. And you can see the shadow from it. And it's the shadow, you can see the shadow going this way. And here it says, Arcanum Sacratus Cuncta Adoptus, which, if you translate this, Arcanum Secruto Cuncta Adeptus, you'll see that it means a great secret or mystery is hidden from all obtaining. Again, what this is saying is a great secret hidden from all being able to obtain it. What would the sun shining on a compass have anything to do with a great secret being held from all obtaining? And I don't know exactly, but it's something that has to do with the sun and compasses. And in the early days, this is how you would do celestial navigation. and essentially prove that the earth is a sphere. It's how Eratosthenes did it. He did it with the shadows of the stick, or the well experiment. And so, once again, I'm wondering why there is such a secret or symbolism here for the Pythagorean theorem, because the Pythagorean theorem was again used by Eratosthenes to prove a spherical earth. And I'm not going to get into sphere or flat earth here, but I will notice that there is some kind of a secret from all obtaining that has something to do with a compass and the sun. So not only to this day, but since the very founding of America, we can find the Star of David. Here is the Seal of David, or the Star of Solomon, right next to the square and compass on a fireback from Massachusetts, circa 1756. And a closer look at that, of course, you could see the fireback, square and compass. You could call this a pentagram, I guess, and right next to the Seal of Solomon. In a discussion of objects of Masonic importance that also have Jewish significance, the Temple of King Solomon is probably the most important for the Masons. And I will show that again in this ancient Freemason book, which is written entirely in code. And, well, not entirely. The index is in plain English, I guess. But the majority of this book is written completely in code. So if you would like to read this book, you're going to have to be good at cryptology. And in the back of the book, we can find something that we can actually read here. King Solomon. So we could see how important King Solomon and King Solomon's temple is to the Freemasons. Even the black and white checkered floor that you will find at all Masonic lodges is a reference to King Solomon's temple. Because the Freemasons trace their lineage to the stonemasons who helped build King Solomon's temple, it has particular significance to them. So I don't know how much more clear you need to get on a connection between Freemasonry and Jews when they have traced their heritage back to the Freemasons who built King Solomon's temple in Israel. Now, I've only begun to touch on this thesis, and there is much, much more information to cover. But for the length of the video, I'm going to have to leave the rest of the document up to the reader to learn for themselves. But my final conclusion is that the United States of America is the land of the Freemason, not the land of the free, home of the brave. It's a bunch of nonsense. And when you can't even go grocery shopping without putting a cloth diaper on your head, I don't know why you would call this land of the free, but this is certainly land of the Freemason. And we can see that since the beginning, since Christopher Columbus even came to America, that this all along was a Jewish enterprise. And I believe that they came to America in search for a land that was free, where they could practice Freemasonry without being expelled from countries, which was happening frequently for them. Everywhere the Jews went, they were getting kicked out of countries. And if you look into Freemasonry and its occultic, Luciferian, satanic roots, I can see why that people don't want to have Freemasonry around at all. So when Spain was going to kick them out, they used all their money and loaded up onto 3 boats, the Nina Pinta and Santa Maria, and they went sailing to a land that they knew was there because it had already been mapped by Pyrees and all kinds of other people who had been to America. The Tartarians were already there. And when Christopher Columbus got off the boat with full of Jews to their land of the Freemason, where they could freely practice their occultic religion, they were surprised to find Tartarians, and lo and behold, these were the other lost 10 tribes of Israel. So now that we have some of the facts straight about Christopher Columbus, why they came to America, and really truth about the founding of America and how it was founded on Freemasonry, and even the Constitution of the Freemason comes before the Constitution of the United States. So no surprise that the first president of the United States was a prolific Freemason, And this guy was entrenched in Freemasonry, and all the architecture that they have in places like Washington, D.C. are all Masonic architecture. And this guy even went out to lay the cornerstone of the United States Capitol building on September 18, 1793, which has specific astronomical significance. But we can see here that George Washington was a very infamous Freemason, and all of the U.S. presidents after him were as well. And here we got him with the hand in the coat, or the hidden hand, or they call that the lion's paw, where they put their hand inside of their coat like this. That's certainly a Freemason sign right there. And anytime you're going to speak up or say anything negative about the Jews, of course, you're going to be called an anti-this or an anti-that. But I believe Henry Ford was a smart guy, and it's interesting that he had to write 4 books on the dangers of the international Jew. The International Jew, the World's Problem, was the headline on some papers. And you will see aspects of Jewish power in the United States, Jewish influence on the American life, Jewish activities in the United States, and the International Jew, the World's Foremost Problem. These are all linked to Freemasonry and how Freemasonry needs to be abolished once and for all, and it should not be allowed to exist. It needs to be squashed. So if I was to join any political party, it would not be a Republican or Democrat. It would only be the anti-Masonic Party, as that is the biggest problem in the United States, is that this is the land of the Freemason and the United States of Israel. Tartary, a vast country in the northeastern parts of Asia, bounded by Siberia to the north and west. This is called Great Tartary. I'm reading from the 1771 Encyclopedia Britannica. Here we have a book from 1681, and it's the Voyages of Jean Struyes in Tartary. Obviously, people are at war, and they have impressive ports and cities. Here we have depictions of the Tartary man and woman, stunning architecture, and of course, star forts, as you can see, surrounded by water, exactly as the Statue of Liberty is. And another thing to note is the architecture style here. We can see that it has the pillars, as well as the triangular piece here, circle in the middle. You might just recognize that if you looked at something like the U.S. Capitol building. 1777, letters of the origin of the sciences. And I have had to translate from French. We can see here that the Tartars, once masters of China. The Tartars had populated 1,200 years before the islands of the Eastern Sea. And the Japanese and the Tartars have a beautiful genius. The translation for this is right here. You can see the Tartars have a genie belliquous, and this is a beautiful genius. Translation to that is they're very intelligent. They have a beautiful genius. The Voyages of Ferdinand Mendez Pinto, 1583. A Tartar commander enters with his army into the town of Queensay. And it was also reported that one chief Tartar commander was coming not about a league and a half from Queensay with an army of 62,000 horse. And without being able to speak any word of any purpose, to save ourselves we prayed. A system of geography of the terraqueous globe from 1744. The present state of Great Tartary. And listed in here amongst a bunch of other information, we can see that it has a whole section on government. So let's see what Wikipedia could say about this. Tartary, a blanket term used in Western European literature and cartography. Tartary became the most common name for Central Asia in a series of negatively colored names and had no connection with real polities, or that is form of government, a form or process of civil government or constitution, an organized society. So it had no connection to any real government or society or ethnic groups of the region. So it's just a blanket term that they used to describe some area on the map. And it has no connection to any government or ethnic groups or anything like that. That's quite in contrast to what I've just seen from historical references. I'm calling bullshit on Wikipedia for this one. A general map of the kingdom of Tartaria. As we can see on this map, this Grand Tartary is larger than any of these other small countries like China, India, especially Europe. Here's Urbano Monet's map, and if we look at that, we can see that there are Tartarians here, Tartarians here, Tartarians here, here, Tartary, Tartarians. This whole entire area is all Tartarians. It looks like this girl may have had a bit of a slip there, but other than that, we can see this is the Grand Tartary, and again, it's depicting a people and a government. Of course, the books that we've already read, we know that they have armies with horses, buildings with a very familiar style of architecture, and in the division of the habitable earth in square miles, Tartary has control over more square miles at a whopping 3 million than any other country in the entire world. With detailed information on climate, government, trade, character, religion, customs, tobacco they are immoderately fond of, but instead of blowing the smoke out of their mouths, they hold a little water in their mouths with which they swallow the smoke down, which so intoxicates them that they soon lose their senses and throw up the phlegm. And they will repeat this several times a day. Man, these guys sound like they know how to have a good time. And in curiosities, we can see that there is a great wall which separates Tartary from China, built by the Chinese to hinder the frequent incursions of the Tartars. Not the Mongols, but Tartars. Just as we can see on the map right here, a wall of 400 leagues built between the bottoms of the mountains by the King of China against the incursions of the Tartars. Because the King of Tartary has fallen upon the city of Pequin with such a great army as has never been seen since Adam's time, where 27 kings under whom marched 1,800,000 men, whereof 600,000 were on horse, and 80,000 rhinoceros that drew the wagons. And given that Queen Say is somewhere right around here, you could see why the Great Wall was built against the incursions of the Tartars. But remember, this is just an area that blanket term we use to put on the map for some area that didn't have any government or ethnic groups in the region at all. And if you think Tartarians are just Mongols, they definitely are not. There was plenty of Caucasian Tartarians, and I'm not sure why this guy looks like such a fruitcake, but he is. He's got his braids on and his pretty bows up here. Nevertheless, I'm not going to go to an axe fight with him because, by the sounds of it, he has a rhinoceros to back him up. Russia and her colonies, 1952, talks about the Communist Party to proceed with a scientific revision of the history of Tartaria, and that this is intended to deprive Tartar history of all national Tartar features to the extent that it becomes Russian history. This is mentioned in the declassified CIA document from 1957. Tartar history was to be rewritten. Let us be frank, it was to be falsified. It looks like Tartary was multi-religious and multicultural. And here are some of the common depictions of leaders like Genghis Khan and what we think they look like in today's drawings. However, here are the 15th to 18th century books and how they saw these same people. Here is Genghis Khan with his wife. And some more depictions here of Genghis Khan. Again, much different than what we would perceive Genghis Khan to look like today. Here's Tamerlane, and you could see here quite a different resemblance to the common depiction of, we assume that he was a Mongol, so he would look like one of these guys. And according to history, certainly not a Mongol, looking much more what we would call European. In fact, this would be a Tartarian. And couldn't find any 17th or 18th century Batu Khan images, but in Turkey there are a few busts of the following gentlemen, and Batu Khan is one of them. And look at the dates on these. This is real interesting and quite hard to figure out. These 1368 to 1507, Timur, 552 to 743, 1526 to 1858, 375 to 454. Now that year range seems like something we're used to, but 1526 to 1858. But what's going on with this guy? Now you'll notice in all these maps of Tartaria, all they need to do is cross the Bering Strait to get to Alaska, and we could see that there are cities already established over here in Canada or the United States. In fact, California is marked on this map, and there's a lot of different maps like this one which show the color to signify which kind of country is in control of that area. We could see yellow here for Tartaria, and it looks like that extends into the United States. And sure enough, if you look up here, it says that there are Tartarians in this area with the society, and we can cross-reference that on the Urbano-Monet map. If we go across the Bering Strait into America, we can see that all the way over here into Canada, that right up here there is these camps of Tartars. And I will say that the information on this map seems very accurate. As you go into the North Dakota area, you will find buffalo drawn, even though they're bad drawings, and you can translate this, and it says that here are animals that look like horses or cows, but they have a mane like a lion, and that's the perfect description for a buffalo. And it says there's a hump on their back like a camel. And again, this is right in the area where North Dakota's at, Yellowstone. So the fact that we have buffalo in the Yellowstone area, I would say the information on this map is quite accurate. I can't figure out the griffin part. However, it does have Tartarians listed in Canada and multiple cities down here in America, including San Francisco. Much prior to the founding of San Francisco in 1850. Just south of San Francisco, we could see that there are volcanoes. Once again, another map saying that America was discovered in 1492 by Christopher Columbus. However, up here, there is a society is beginning on the land, and they are Tartarians. So who was here? Who discovered the land? I mean, you can't say Christopher Columbus discovered the land when it already says the Tartarians are already here with the society. Here we have a map of the universe, and Grand Tartary taking up this entire area, that they have essentially conquered this entire area. Even in a time when North and South America are accurately mapped, we still have Grand Tartary as this massive area, and China, the Mongol, and Persia. So definitely you can't say that the Tartarians are just Mongols. The Mongols are down here. Here we have America split in half. Presumably maybe the pink is for the European settlers who had started on the East Coast and moved to the West. And it says here, having achieved the conquest, the Tartars and their descendants had a much harder task to perform, and this was to subdue the ferocious and warlike European colonists who had entrenched and fortified themselves in the country. So another reference that America was originally land of the Tartarians. Here is the Daily Nebraska State Journal talking about the area which we would have seen on the map over here, where these buffalo are near Nebraska, where we know Tartarians are nearby. And it says here, Tartarax, where rax is Latin for king, so this would mean Tartar king. The monarch returns to his old realm of Quiveria. He reigns for a day. An illustration of the mythology of Nebraska. So Nebraska is already saying that there was a Tartar king who is going to return to Nebraska, to his realm of Quiveria. Here is a picture of Nebraska in 1898. And I would like to draw attention to the architecture in the background. Look at the statues up here. Look at some of this magnificent architecture. This building back here. It is not something I would expect to find in Nebraska in 1898. But perhaps it had been there a very long time, as there was a Tartarian king at this area previously. The official history is hiding a major world power which existed as late as the 19th century. Tartary was a country with its own flag, its own government, its own place on the map. Its territory was huge, but somehow quietly incorporated into Russia and some other countries. Here is an engram of Google Books which shows how Tartaria was quietly put away throughout the years. Tartary and Tartaria show up in books very frequently, very popular topic in books. And as we got closer to 1850, 1900 and 1950, it just pretty much disappeared and nobody talked about it anymore. However, sometime in the 18th century, Tartary Muscovite was the biggest country in the world with 3 million square miles. In just 1744, we can see they had more land than any other country, of course. Bellum Tartaricum, or the conquest of the great renowned empire of China by the invasion of the Tartars. History of the conquest of China by the Tartaries. Voyage and Travels, the complete history of Muscovy and Tartary. The army of the Tartars, the kingdom of the Tartars, the emperors of the Tartars, the wandering life of the Tartars. Now, if you were to go to Ancestry.com and order a genealogy test from your DNA, do you think that it would tell you if Tartarians were in your bloodline? Tartary had its own language, its own flag, its own emperor, and of course it had its own people who are completely removed from history at this point. Here we have 7 distinct characters in costume in 6 different languages: Russian, German, English, French, Tartarian, and Italian. Wherefore it's impossible to write anything in the Tartarian language. The Tartarian tablets, the inscribed tablets found in Romania, may be 1,000 years older than the oldest examples of writing from Mesopotamia. Here's a book called Fem Im Den from 1929, an anti-religious, whatever that means, magazine in the Tartarian language. I've found a copy of it here. And here is the book written in the Tartarian language. Fem Ham Den 1, 1929. Here's a genealogy of the former Tartar emperors. And of course they have a complete genealogy here of all of their emperors. Of course, multiple depictions of the people of Tartary. I've talked about this image before in a previous video about Christopher Columbus. And this hand symbol is the same hand symbol that Christopher Columbus uses. Here we see a clear distinction between the Mongols and the Tartars. 1865, Standard Atlas of the World. We still have flags for the Kingdom of Tartary. The flag and crest of Tartary had an owl depicted on it, and the Emperor's flag contained a griffin on a yellow background. Here is the Empire of Tartary and their owl. in the History of the Inductive Sciences by William Wilhelm, a catastrophe annihilated that highly scientific nation, which, according to Bailey, existed in remote ages in the center of Tartary. And this book even takes it so far to say that the data collected by Ptolemy was, in fact, observations made in Tartary itself, and that the determination of the circumference of the earth reported by Aristotle could not have been executed by either the Greeks nor by any of the ancient known peoples. And the conclusion is that the ancient people who perfected the sciences, the people who formerly carried out the great enterprise of the exact measurement of earth, lived at the parallel of 49 degrees, and that is the Tartars, based from our most exact modern observations. And he's saying that the root of this astronomical knowledge does not come from Aristotle and Ptolemy, but in fact it comes from the Tartarians. American Antiquities and Discoveries in the West from 1834, an exhibition of evidence that an ancient population of partially civilized nations differing entirely from those of the present Indians lived in America many centuries before its discovery by Columbus. So we can see that Tartarians have been removed from history. They were a kingdom with kings and culture and people and armies, and they were conquering the entire world. They owned more land than anybody. There's hints that they had more people than anybody else in the world, and that they did in fact cross the Bering Strait, come into the United States, and start building cities in the United States and Canada. In the following videos, we will look at the cities which they have established in the United States. There are photographs and evidence of the Tartarian cities that have now been completely destroyed and removed from the history books. The only thing left is they say there was some Indians here who ran around with teepees, but the truth is, if we look at our history, we will find that there were massive cities here in the United States which have all now been destroyed, and there are very few remnants left over of those cities. But one of them, as already seen, is in Nebraska, and architecture built by Tartarians would have still been around in Omaha before it was destroyed in the previous 100 years. And we'll even look into the possibility that some of these cities in North America were in fact the 7 cities of gold, which were thought to exist here in North America. The 12 tribes of Israel were once a united kingdom in the land of Israel and ruled by the great kings David and Solomon. So that's when Solomon's temple was built. And Solomon's temple was perhaps one of the greatest architectural feats ever completed, and definitely one of the most mysterious. Now, the 12 tribes of Israel are the descendants of Jacob, and eventually 10 of them were lost or removed from history. And for being such a controversial group, they're only mentioned in the Bible twice. 1 Kings 11:31, "Take for yourself 10 pieces, thus says the Lord your God of Israel. See, I'm about to tear the kingdom from the hand of Solomon and will give you 10 tribes." And there's not all that much history from that point on. And then the history ends with the destruction of the kingdom by the Assyrians in the year 722 BCE. And then the Assyrians exile the 10 tribes to the east, and from that moment the 10 tribes are lost from historical record. And I don't think it's accurate to say they're lost from historical record, but they were removed from historical record. So the 10 tribes of Israel, their names are Reuben, Simon, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Manasseh, and Ephraim. All of them but Judah and the tribe of Benjamin. We see the Jewish historian Josephus wrote that the 10 tribes are beyond the Euphrates till now, and are an immense multitude not to be estimated in numbers. So we can see when we look at a map of Tartary, and we're theorizing in this video that the lost 10 tribes of Israel are in fact the Tartarians. When it says that they're an immense multitude not to be estimated in numbers, an immense multitude of people would definitely line up with an immense multitude of land that they would inhabit. So there's at least the first connection, but this is Israel, so to the east would be Tartary. Let's look at some more historical text. The name Azareth, the name of the land beyond the great river, far away from the habitation of man, in which the 10 tribes of Israel will dwell, observing the laws of Moses, until the time of the restoration, according to 4 Esdras 13. Now, Columbus identified America as this land, and we will see why momentarily. Now, here we go again. Azareth, a region beyond the Euphrates River, which the Assyrians supposedly took the 10 tribes after the destruction of the northern kingdoms, and from which it was expected they would return in the last days. And they definitely are expected to return in the last days, as the prophet Isaiah promises their return in Isaiah 27:13. Let's take a look at the text of 2 Esdras 13. 2 Esdras is also called 4 Esdras, so they kind of have two names there, but here's chapter 13 and verse 45. Throughout that region there was a long way to go, a journey of about a year and a half, and that country is called Azareth, and they dwell there until the last times. Now, Azareth is not easy to locate on very many maps, but let's take a look at the maps we can find. Here we go, 1596 on this one, and here is Azareth, and of course this is in Tartary. This is a map of Tartary, and here's Azareth. Here are the 10 tribes, and I can't translate the rest. If you could translate, please put it in the comments below. And we can see 4 Esdras captured 13, or chapter 13. So it even mentions the chapter and verse where Azareth and the 10 tribes came. Now let's look up here where it talks about Naphtali. Now again, that is one of the tribes of Israel, Naphtali. Naphtali, and I cannot translate this text, but here we get Danitas, so D-A-N, and again here D-A-N, Danimarki, which I believe corresponds to the tribe of Dan, just as we have the, it's talking also about the tribe of Naphtali, and it's possible it's talking about some of the other tribes, and I just can't translate it correctly. But we could see where they are at on the map. Here is the tribe of Dan, and here is the tribe of Naphtali, the Naphtali horde. And it's possible some of the others are listed here. It's interesting here we get Rubini, which may correspond with Reuben, the tribe of Reuben. But there's multiple tribes names written here, and as well as Azareth, and these are all within Tartaria. And I'm going to turn back to a map of the Holy Land, which this would be Israel before the tribes were driven out. And we can see that more or less the tribe of Gad, tribe of Reuben, they were of course separated physically and geographically by their tribes. And the tribe of Benjamin, right down here is Nazareth, and here's the tribe of Naphtali, and here's Dan. So interesting that Naphtali and Dan are located right next to each other in the Holy Land, in Israel. And later, when they were kicked out of Israel and went to Azareth, it appears that Naphtali and Dan are once again neighbors with each other. Now, I'm not sure where this would be located at on our current map of Earth. The Bering Strait's right here, and it extends almost to the North Pole, it looks like. So if we look at Google Earth, here's the Bering Strait, and this would be Tartária, and it looks like it extends quite a bit north from there, and so I'm not sure. There's some islands up this way, and maybe kind of this landmass right here that looked like it might be a higher elevation. So it's hard to say. Maybe even something going up, you know, a land like this, but this is a good possibility in this area. And here the Bering Strait, and again reaching up towards the North Pole. So it's possible these areas are underwater now. Let's take a look at some other maps. Here we have Azareth, and again this is a Tartary map. Azareth, and it's pretty much says the same information. The 10 tribes came here, and here are the 10 tribes. We've got Naphtali, the tribe of Dan, Naphtali and Dan up here. So again, the lost tribes of Israel being placed directly in Tartaria, and now we see this tent, which is something we also find over here on their original Holy Land map when they were in Israel. You know, here we've got this tent with the, you know, this kind of almost circus style tent. I don't know what to call it other than that. That's how we see it here in the United States nowadays, and this little ball at the top, and you get this very similar looking tent, almost as if the same people were building these tents. Now this map is real interesting. It's a map of Christian influence, more or less, from 1600. And we can see up here Tinduck, many Christians, and some Christians. You know, it's listing what kind of Christians or how many of them. And then as you get over here to Europe, you get Protestants, mostly Protestant. So kind of a map of religious influence around 1600. And up here in Asia, or Tartaria lists here, it says that many Christians, Tinduck, many Christians, almost as if this was kind of the root of Christianity, or the most influence of Christians was up here in Tinduck, it seems. Now it's interesting to look at this because in Asia, which is Tartary, in Asia are the Christians, and under the Patriarchy of Jerusalem. So we get the Christians under the Patriarchy of Jerusalem. Now again, we have a connection from Israel or Jerusalem right up into this area. This of course is where Azareth is located at, and we get the Christians underneath the Patriarchy of Jerusalem. Very interesting. We have a direct connection from Israel, or the tribes of Israel, to this area up here and the Christianity that's in this area. And going on to the next map, this one does not list Azareth specifically, but it does have Tinduck and the kingdom where Christians reigned in the year 1290. And here's the Bering Strait. It's also interesting to note that the Great Wall of China was built between the bottoms of the mountains by the King of China against the incursions of the Tartars. And here we have Queen Se, and it seems to be historically correct that the Great Wall of China was built to keep the Tartarians out. Here is the Voyages and Adventures of Ferdinand Mendez Pinto, and we can see that this has a real in-depth description of the taking of the town of Queen Se by the Tartars. A Tartar commander enters with his army into the town of Queen Se, and they violently took over and completely wiped out and even burned cities straight to the ground. So the Tartar commander with his army entering into the town of Queen Se, and like we could see on the map right here, Queen Se and the Great Wall of China right there to protect this land against the incursions of the Tartars. And here we go again, the wall between China and Tartaria. I also want to bring up the mountain of Alchai, where the sepulchres of the kings of Tartaria. And it looks as though pyramids are built here. And that is exactly what the Egyptians did. What's inside of the pyramids? Well, the pyramids, like the pyramids that came before and after them, were royal tombs, the final resting place for their pharaohs or kings. So it's interesting that the Egyptians are doing that, and when we look on the maps and we see Mount Alchai, where the sepulchres are, or the tombs of the kings of Tartaria, we see pyramids. And let's take a real quick read from Marco Polo about the Tartarians. And he also seen Mount Alchai, of a city called Euphina, and many notable things of Tartaria. And here it talks about Prester John. So Prester John and the Tartars. But here we get the Tartars and many marvelous and strange things. So all the kings, the successors of the first kings, were buried in the mountain called Alchai, where they dwelled the great king. And when the great king died, they carried him and buried him there. And when they carried him or go with him, they kill as many as they meet in the way or in the street. And when they kill them, they say, "Go and serve the Lord in the other world." And they believe certainly that they go and do him service. And likewise, by this reason, when a great king dies, they kill all his camels, horses, and mules, believing that they serve the Lord in the other world. When the king of the Tartars died, there were slain 300,000 men that they encountered in the way by those that went with him to his burial to the said mountain. Now, 300,000 people getting killed sounds ridiculous, but remember, there's a historical count that there are such an immense multitude of people that they're not to be estimated in numbers, and they also have the most land out of everybody in the world. So not only maps, but also written accounts that the mountains of Alchai or Alkai, where the tombs are of the kings of Tartaria. And we see here on this map Mount Alkai, where the tombs are, and we get pyramid shapes. This one has Mount Alchai and without pyramids. Maybe the pyramids were destroyed. In fact, the pyramids must have been destroyed if there were pyramids. I don't know that there were. They certainly are not there now. But many of these maps show these essentially triangles coming out of the mountain that really look like pyramids, which we know are at least the tombs of the Egyptians. I want to go back for just a moment to this Tinduk area where many Christians, and it seems like there's a root of Christianity there. This map is showing, of course, Tartaria, and if we scroll in here to Tinduk, it's kind of hard to read, but we can see it's the kingdom in which Christians, and it says M. Paul Veneti at the year 1290. And we can see definitely it's talking about M. Paul Veneti in the year 1290. And all of these other maps, this one has Tinduk, but all the other ones also mentioned the year 1290. And many of them mention M. Paul Veneti. This one, I believe, just has 1290. This one says many Christians. This map has M. Paul Veneti on it, but it's up here, the island of M. Paul Veneti. It talks about it right here, that M. Paul Veneti. So definitely this guy played an important role, and it seems that it's associated with Christians in the year 1290, specifically, as we can see on this map. Christians and Paul Veneti in 1290. So Paul Veneti is talking about supposedly Paul of Venice. So he lived from 1369 to 1429, which does not line up with the year 1290, and I'm wondering what's the discrepancy there. But we could see here that this is definitely Paul Veneti, and we get the sphere earth with the cross on top of it. There is the bird, as we see the double-headed Masonic bird, or the single-headed bird that's on the US dollar. And this looks like a real fancy bow, and not really looking like a Christian evangelist, but more of a conquering warrior. This map, in addition to talking about Paul Veneti here, it also talks about him right down here at Japan. It says that Japan Island, where Paul Veneti went to talk about Christ, is at least talking about Paul Veneti and Christ. So while this guy is basically, I've never even heard of him myself, and Wikipedia really doesn't say much about him. Really, certainly doesn't talk about Japan or any Christian movement in Upper Asia, Tartária, none of that. And in fact, it has his complete year wrong according to these maps. So I'm not sure, but another mystery to unlock on this guy, and why he's so prevalent in some of these old maps and talked about so much. We can at least say that there is a definitive link between Jerusalem, Christianity in the Tinduck area, and the fact that somehow this Christianity under the Patriarch of Jerusalem has made its way here. See Jerusalem straight up into Tartaria. Now, going back to the land of Azareth, I just want to draw two similarities here. The first one is Nazareth, and Nazareth is the childhood home of Jesus. But of course, if you take the N off, you're left with Azareth, which is where the 10 tribes of Israel went. So there's just an interesting observation. One, and the second one is Azeroth, and this is the world in the World of Warcraft, and there are humans here. So it's Azeroth, which is obviously a purposeful misspelling of Azareth. So it's safe to say that the humans of Azeroth may be perhaps a lost tribe of Israel. And here we have Urbano Monet's map, which is a flat earth map, or a polar azimuthal equidistant map. And not only does it have, these mysterious lands at the North Pole, it of course has Azareth. And it even talks about the 10 tribes of Israel. And we can see here that it's in Tartaria. And this is the Tartar Sea. And over here, the Bering Strait. And like all the other maps, we have Azareth, where the 10 tribes of Israel went, located directly across the Bering Strait. Now, is it possible that the Tartarian people, or the 10 tribes of Israel, instead of only moving up this way, like Naphtali and Dan did, but in fact, they went across the Bering Strait over here in the United States? Well, on this map, we can see that there are camps here, and there are Tartars. So they definitely made it up into Canada. Here is Quiveria, in which he has drawn and also described buffaloes. And I believe that Quiveria is Omaha, Nebraska. This is a picture of Omaha, Nebraska before it was completely all destroyed and smashed to the ground by the Freemasons during the World Fair. And I believe this was architecture and statues, which were of course built by the Tartarians. This was a Tartarian city. and the Tartarian city of Quiveria. This was 1898 in Omaha. Clearly not architecture built by the American settlers. One more picture of Omaha, Nebraska, and you can see some of the great architecture that used to be there, and some of the statues. Absolutely breathtaking. And here's the Daily Nebraska State Journal from 1889, and Tartarax. Rex in Latin means king, R-E-X. So Tartarex would mean the Tartar king. And you can see that the monarch returns to his old realm of Quiveria. He reigns for a day. So here is yet another connection between Nebraska, Omaha, Nebraska, and Quiveria, and it says that basically the Tartar king is going to return to his own old realm of Quiveria. And that is why I say I believe that Quiveria is, for one, it's a region, but the city of Quiveria, I believe, is on Omaha, Nebraska, and its location right here by the river would also be correct for Omaha. Any more evidence of the Tartarians in North America? America, 1492, Christopher Columbus. What do we have here? Here there are people in camps, societies beginning in tents, and they're Tartarians. You're telling me when Christopher Columbus got to America, there was also Tartarians here? Let's take a look at this map. Christopher Columbus. And it even has him drawn. He's got the red collar, the black hat. You can see Christopher Columbus. But right over here at the Bering Strait, and the text is going across the Bering Strait as if from this area, as if the text is talking about both the Tinduck area and across the Bering Strait up by Alaska. It basically says the same thing here. There's people starting in tents or camps, and society is starting, and they're Tartarians. So this even has the same exact color, as if they're owned by the same people, and it's clear that the Tartarians did cross from the Tinduck area over the Bering Strait into America. And we can see that depicted also in a painting right here. We have Christopher Columbus. I know this is Christopher Columbus because we are at South America or Central America where he landed. He has the red coat and the black hat, just like he does up here. There he is, Christopher Columbus. So Christopher Columbus has gotten off of the boat over here at America, and who did he encounter? Well, some Native Americans back here sitting in a hammock. But who is this guy? Because he has the same skin color as Christopher Columbus, and he looks like a warrior from ancient Greece or something like that. If I didn't know any better, I would think that that guy belonged to a city like this. And of course, this is Chicago, before it was completely destroyed to the ground by the Freemasons, which I've covered thoroughly in a separate video. But we can see that this guy that Christopher Columbus encountered came from a city like this. Not only the type of clothes he's wearing, you know, again, it looks like some kind of ancient Greek warrior who would come out of a city like this one. And certainly not a Native American with this metal shield and mace. I'll also point out that it appears the red, white, and blue comes from the Native Americans, as we see here, America, with the Indian lady and the red, white, and blue colors. And a quick side note that the bride chase is a marriage custom that came from the Tartars. And I've read about that in another book. I forget which one. But here we see it depicted on a map. So there's all kinds of evidence that the Tartarians definitely crossed the Bering Strait into the United States and Canada, and that they were establishing cities and kingdoms in North America. In fact, if you look at the map from Urbano Monet and you go to Azareth, where they would have began their society, you find cities, and cities by these red buildings, these red triple building. We could see what a city is. And this is an established city that's been there a long time. This was their route where they started from. And as they expand to the east, they start to get into tents and chariots, because they're moving eastward and they're conquering this entire area, and they have tents over here. But as you get back towards Azareth, you'll notice that it's not tents but established cities. They have these cities built. And if you cross the Bering Strait, you'll find the same thing. We find established cities. The city of Quiveria, all the way down to the city of San Francisco is right here on the map. San Francisco, located right next to volcanoes. And there's all these cities that have been established. But as you move further from Azareth to the west, you'll notice that the cities disappear and they become Tartarian tents. So looking at a view of this map, we can see that the Azareth area, they have all established cities in this area, taking over a huge part of the globe. And anywhere that they don't have cities established, they're starting to build these tents. And it's starting to begin society, start with the tents, it looks like, and then build up society from there. And that's why, as they expanded to the east over here to the west, and down south, that we read about in the books, the raiding of the city of Quincy and the Great Wall of China going up to protect against the excursions of the Tartars. So obviously they were also going this way to the east, this way to the west, and south, conquering essentially as much land as they could. And it's no surprise that we find out that the 10 tribes of Israel are an immense multitude, not to be estimated in numbers. This is basically a census for the world, and it's from 1744. And it lists how much land each country owns. And here we get Tartar, and they have more land than anybody else in the world. Tartary Muscovite, 3 million square miles, whereas Russia is here with 1 million square miles. So now the Tartary and Russia are really in the same area, but you can see that Tartary owns more land than anybody else in the entire world. They are the world power, slaying 300,000 people when a king dies. And they also have more land than anybody else. That lines up with what we know of the lost 10 tribes, that they're an immense multitude, not to be estimated in numbers. We know that the Tartarian people are extremely good at architecture, probably the best architects in the world. And Freemasons trace their roots back to the stonemasons who built King Solomon's temple. Not only that, but King Solomon used the Star of David, and the star was said to have magical properties, and its inscription on the signet of Solomon was said to have given him access to the genius that helped him build the temple. The temple has specific significance to the Masons because they trace their history back to the stonemasons who worked on it. So the stonemasons, the Freemasons, believe that their roots are Jews, or the tribes of Israel, who built King Solomon's temple. Specifically, the ones mentioned in 1 Kings 5:15, Solomon had 70,000 carriers and 80,000 stonecutters in the hills. The Masons believe that their heritage comes from these stonecutters, and they, of course, are Jews, as they are the tribes of Israel. And so Freemasonry does have its roots in the building of King Solomon and the actual stonecutters who were in Israel. That is why the Freemasons are obsessed with King Solomon, and that's why all the Masonic lodges are built after King Solomon's. The checkered floor even is supposedly has a connection to King Solomon's temple. But the connection between the tribes of Israel and the Tartarians is the ability to build magnificent architecture. Here, of course, King Solomon's temple is no doubt a magnificent work. And when we look at North America and all of the magnificent architecture that was destroyed, for example, here in San Francisco, this does not align with architecture that could have been built by the early American settlers. It is in fact architecture that was already here, and it was built by the Tartarians. Of course, the Tartarians had made their way into North America and were building cities here. They had cities. We could see the difference between the Tartarian architecture of San Francisco and what the American settlers were able to build with their skills, but certainly not the grand architecture that they inherited when they came to America. So the link of the ability to build grand architecture and perhaps a special genius to build such exquisite architecture and phenomenal fountains such as this one, which is carved completely out of stone. It has a hollow stone sphere that rotates in this fountain and also lights up. It had a light on the inside of it. And we know from these photos from the early 1900s that these fountains have significant wear and tear on them. They're falling apart, and they certainly are much, much older than 1850, which is the year San Francisco was founded. No, this is absolutely Tartarian architecture, a Tartarian-built fountain, which was destroyed by Freemasons during the Great World Fairs. So there's certainly a link between the tribes of Israel having an ability to put together this amazing architecture, and also the Tartarian people having the ability to build grand architecture that we cannot replicate today. Now it's pretty clear why the Freemasons had to destroy this beautiful architecture and just completely tear it all to the ground and leave nothing left but ruins. Because they had to make sure that the 10 tribes of Israel remain lost from history. And again, it's no accident that the 10 tribes are lost from historical record. They have been intentionally removed from historical record. And that is what we see here. The intentional removing of the Tartarians from historical record, and some of their great works and things that we should be able to go out and see today here in the United States of America, and we can't because it was built by Tartarians, who I believe are the 10 lost tribes of Israel, and the destruction of all of their architecture here in North America. Undeniably a Masonic endeavor in which they made millions and millions of dollars, and prominent names that are still out there today were associated with this. John Quincy Adams, Charles Schwab, I believe this is Les Schwab from the tires, and some of the people who were involved with destroying all of the Tartarian architecture are actually some of the most rich and prominent businesses that are still around today. Now, circling back to the beginning with Christopher Columbus, it's easy to see why Christopher Columbus would have thought that America was Azareth. As we see here, Azareth. Columbus identified America with this land. And when he got off of the boat and he found Tartarians and Tartarian architecture, he probably immediately assumed that he had found the land of Azareth, where the lost 10 tribes were at. But going forward to today, where we have access to some of these maps, and we can see that Azareth was in fact on the other side of the Bering Strait, and all of the 10 tribes had to do, or one of the 10 tribes, or a couple of the 10 tribes, was cross over the Bering Strait into America, and they started building their society there. And in closing, I want to say that Tartarian lives matter, because when it comes to Hitler and the anti-Semitic and all this stuff, it's really only talking about the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. These are the group that Hitler went after. Hitler wasn't trying to get the tribes of, the lost 10 tribes, because they were gone and they were not living in Israel at that point. And Hitler was out to get the Jews, the Jews of Israel. So while everyone gets all in a bunch over the Jews, which would be considered the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, let's not forget that the other 10 tribes are also important, and they seem to be anyways Tartarians. And I don't think there's anything more racist, even worse than what Hitler is done, as to have destroyed all of the architecture, take them out of the history book, tell everybody that they aren't even a civilization of people anymore. It's just like a section of land that we used to call Tartary, and to the point where they're not even talked about in history books anymore. And all of their cities that they had built in the United States and elsewhere throughout the world, all of the star forts that we see everywhere, has just been destroyed and taken out of history book like they don't even exist. And that's a greater atrocity than what was done to the other Jews, that they probably are the lost 10 tribes of Israel, and that's why they've been removed from history books. One interesting thing here is that these cities, which were inherited by the early American Masonic settlers, is that it doesn't seem like there was any war that ever went on. And I always wondered, where were the Tartarian people? Because it seems like they just walked into these cities and took them over, and there was no altercation or anything, almost like the cities had already been abandoned by the Tartarian people. So after Columbus had run into the Tartarians, did they abandon their cities? And that's when I thought maybe they were raptured, because if they were the lost 10 tribes of Israel, or God's people, those are God's original people, maybe God actually raptured them and they just disappeared. And that would mean we need an Antichrist. And I don't know of a better match for the Antichrist than Master Mason George Washington himself. I mean, nobody would have ever suspected him as a Mason. Everybody loves him. And a quick look at the characteristics of the Antichrist. He claims to be God and is worshipped. Well, that is Washington, and that is pretty much looks like God to me. This is the apotheosis of Washington, which is on the ceiling of the U.S. Capitol building. And really, you look up here to the heavens and you see the clouds of heaven, and right square in the middle is, there's nothing else to say other than that's God. And that's George Washington. What about this? This is enthroned Washington, a large marble sculpture. And what does that look like? This is a god. In fact, it's based on the great statue, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the statue of a god. And it's interesting to notice that you've got one hand going up and one hand going down, much like you would see with Baphomet, or this, one hand going up and one hand going down. So I don't think it's far-fetched to say that he's worshipped as a god, because Washington definitely is. He will blaspheme God. That's what Freemasonry does. He will display miraculous powers, even causing fire to come down from heaven. And there's not a one-to-one match for that for George Washington, but shortly thereafter, rockets' red glare and bombs bursting in air gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. And if you research that, during the time of George Washington's army was just the time that rocket explosives were starting to be used, and we even have our Star-Spangled Banner singing about that. So that's a pretty close match, if you ask me, to fire coming down from the heaven, rockets' red glare, and all this coming down in the air. The Antichrist comes back to life. I'm not sure there's really a good match for that with George Washington, but ruling in full authority, there's no better match than George Washington. Not only was he the President of the United States, he was also a Mason, so he was, and you're not going to have more power than being a Master Mason and being President of the United States, controlling the world's economy. Whose picture is on the #1 USD in the world? That's right, George Washington's. Antichrist desecrates God's temple. What does Freemasonry do? The Masonic temple certainly desecrates God's temple. The Antichrist attempted destruction of Israel. Destruction of Israel? You mean the 10 lost tribes of Israel and the destruction of all the Tartarian architecture that used to be in North America, and now it's completely gone, funded by the Freemasons? This destruction of... Is this destruction that it's talking about? The destruction of Israel, or the 10 lost tribes of Israel's architecture, causes Earth's armies to fight against Christ? I'm pretty sure that's what Freemasonry is doing, and that's definitely what Antifa and all those guys want to do. Final destiny in the lake of fire. I'm going to leave number 10 up to your interpretation, but George Washington matches about 8 out of 10 of the characteristics of the Antichrist. So I started to wonder if the Empire of Tartary was actually raptured, and we're living in a post-rapture time in which the book of Revelation hasn't fully covered, or there's been little prophecy over the times that we're currently living in. So there's a lot of questions put forth in this video, and if there's any comments or questions you have that can help understand this lost history, since we don't have a lot of books or things or architecture or things of this nature because it's all been destroyed. So anything or clues that you may have, please put them in the comments below so we can collectively get back a little bit of this lost history. Thank you for watching.